Thank you, Matt, for coming on and joining me on the show today. I appreciate you taking the time. You are a professor at University of Washington School of Medicine, research focused on mechanisms of aging, with the goal being to come up with interventions that can actually increase health span in various animals and ultimately, hopefully, humans. And you're also the co-director of the Dog Aging Project, which is a really interesting longitudinal study of tens of thousands of dogs. And, again, hoping to translate some of the learnings from that into humans at some point. So one of the sort of foremost individuals in the space, I think, of aging, and have had some guests on from the area before, but very excited for the conversation. For those who don't know you, would be great if we could just start by sort of hearing your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and some of the decisions you made along the way.
Sure. Thanks, Jake. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. All right. Well, we'll go back to the very beginning. I actually was born in Erie, Pennsylvania, but I grew up in Seattle, which is where I'm located now. And I would say, I come from a family where I'm the first person to graduate from college and to get an advanced degree. So, when growing up, I would say I never really had a clear ambition to get a PhD and go on and do biomedical research at a top tier university. That really wasn't on my radar. In fact, I would say I was sort of a late bloomer in many ways from an academic perspective. I was, let's just say, fairly immature in my teens, as many people are, not very focused on school, didn't really, put a lot of effort into academics. And actually, after I graduated from high school, I didn't go directly to undergraduate college. I spent about, I guess it was probably 3 or 4 years working for United Parcel Service initially as an unloader, and then as a package sorter in the very early morning shift, loading the big brown trucks, and then also had a second job delivering auto glass for Safelite. So maybe not the typical academic track, although I think everybody has their own path for sure. And it was really after being working those two jobs for a couple of years that I decided I probably didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. Started taking classes at a local junior college. Again, I hadn't really narrowed it down even to anything biological at that point. I was just kind of getting my feet back into the academic world and with the plan to get my associate's degree and then see where I ended up. And there were really a couple of things that happened at that point. And this was, I was probably 20, 21 or 22 around this time. One of them was I met the woman who would become my wife. And I think that helped me grow up and become motivated quite a bit. We're still married, by the way. And I had a really fantastic biology teacher at Highline Community College near Seattle, who, I think it was just the right time and right place. And I became very inspired by evolution and natural selection and the beauty and complexity of biology, in large part because of this teacher that I had. And so once I completed my 2-year degree, went to a state college about 90 miles north of Seattle called Western Washington University, where I majored in biochemistry. And my wife majored in biology. And at that point, I think really started to take learning and academia very seriously and sort of immersed myself in biology and biochemistry, such that when I graduated from Western, I ended up going from there to MIT, the biology program at MIT, where I got my PhD. And as you can maybe imagine, that was a bit of a culture shock coming from a relatively small state school to MIT. But it was fantastic. And I actually started studying what I study now, which is the biology of aging, when I was at MIT. So during my first year at MIT, I heard a talk by one of the professors in the biology department there, Lenny Guarenti, where he talked about how his lab was using genetics and molecular biology and biochemistry to try to understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms of biological aging. And I had never thought about aging as something you could study or would study. I was pretty young at the time, and it wasn't personal yet. But I still don't know exactly why I got turned on to that topic. But Lenny's talk really resonated with me, and it was absolutely one of those moments in life where your trajectory shifts, and I became fascinated by the idea that we could study something as complex as the biology of aging. And that's what I ended up doing my PhD thesis work on in Lenny's lab, studying the genetics and molecular biology of aging in a single-celled organism, in budding yeast. And I've continued to work in this field since then. And so I feel very fortunate to have sort of had that opportunity and to have gotten turned on to this topic when I did, because it's been a great ride. It's been a super exciting and fun path. And I think right now is a particularly exciting time in the field, because I feel like we're really on the cusp of this field and this science becoming mainstream and becoming appreciated by the general public. And I think we're also on the cusp of big discoveries that can have an impact in the real world on people's lives. So again, I just feel extremely fortunate to have found my way to where I'm at.
Wow, yeah, that is an amazing story, and appreciate you sharing it. I knew about some of the more recent stuff coming in, but I did not know that you sort of took some time between high school and college and worked at the post office, basically, it sounds like, and also
yeah. Funny story there. My family has a long line of United Postal Service workers. So when I went to work at UPS, I was sort of the I was going to say the black sheep of the family, maybe the brown sheep of the family for a while there.
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's a pretty remarkable story. And then sort of finding in the midst of that, the motivation or drive or whatever it was, sounds like some of it had to do with meeting your wife and maybe just growing up a little bit, but realizing absolutely. Like, I want to go and sort of do something bigger than this and, whatever that might be. And just sort of taking one step at a time, going to community college, developing an interest in bio, then going to graduate school, finding aging. It's just a very cool incremental story that I think hopefully is encouraging for people, sort of regardless of where they are now. If they're young, there's always, or even if they're not so young, there's always time to take a different path. And I think you mentioned sort of there's moments in life when your trajectory just sort of takes a turn, and that's really cool.
Yeah, I think, can I just chime in on that? Because I think that's a super important point. And, I've got two sons, 20 and 16 years old. And I see kids these days and kids, college undergraduates who work in my lab. And so many of them are so impressive. And I look at them and they're so far ahead of where I was, at that age. But I also think it's really important for people to appreciate you don't have to have it all figured out by the time you're 18, 19, 20, 21. Some people mature at different rates. Some people have experiences in their lives early on that influence where they're at a given age. You don't have to have the rest of your life figured out, by the time you're 20 in order to have a fulfilling and successful future. And so I just want people to know, if you're in that position, it's okay. You can always change your trajectory and just keep trying to find the path that's right for you, the thing that you're passionate about. Keep looking until you get there, because it's not too late. And I think that's really important for people to appreciate.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think it sort of reminds me of this interesting point that I consider sometimes being relatively young in my later 20s myself. I think that, if you ask like the average person, and I've seen like polls about this, but, if you ask people if there's a chance that like people alive today, whether, middle-aged or on the younger side, might live, well past 100 or 110 or even 120, most people assign like a pretty decent probability to that. Just your average person, doesn't know anything about the field that you're in and the work that you're doing and your colleagues, but just sort of senses like, humans seem to be living a bit longer and we're figuring things out and technology is getting better, et cetera, et cetera. But no one actually really, no one that I know at least, like sort of plans on, or probability weights that possibility into like their life planning. And so we still sort of think on like the old template of, you go to college at this age, you work for this many years, you retire at 60, you get old and you die.
Yeah.
But no one has sort of priced in the thing that they all sort of agree at least has some decent probability of happening, which is that the whole lifespan actually is going to get extended and you can do useful things for a longer period of time. And I think that's even, it just supports your point even further that like, take your time figuring things out. No need to rush through things. You might have even longer than other people in the past have had to do everything you want to do.
Yeah, I think there's going to be all sorts of interesting and important social discussions that go along with that. I will say, though, it's still a little bit of an open question what the actual life expectancy, is going to be and what that trajectory is going to be at sort of a population level. Obviously, it's an open question. Nobody can predict the future. I share your perception and your optimism that it's likely that we will see relatively significant technologies come online that can enhance human lifespan, certainly human health span. I think maybe that's an even more important concept to consider, the period of life that is spent, high functioning, relatively good health, that will be expanded through the kinds of discoveries that have been made and continue to be made in the field that I work in. How long it'll take to see those technologies become widely available, I think is an open question. But you're absolutely right that many people are very likely to have 20 years of additional healthy life, and thinking about what that means for that, the sort of stereotypical path of you start your career in your early 20s, you work for 40 years and then you retire. You may have another 20, 30 years on top of that are quality years of life. And many people do already, right? And so thinking about what that means, can you have two careers? Sure, you can have two careers. Can you find something that you absolutely love and you're not going to want to retire? Sure, you can do that. But definitely thinking about that now makes a lot of sense. And, I think that there are a lot more people thinking along these lines and starting to think about what are the potential policy implications, what are the economic implications. Do we need to change the retirement age? Absolutely, we're going to if this continues. But on the other hand, and I don't want to be negative at all, but I do think we have to be realistic. When you look at some of the population level trends in terms of obesity and sedentary lifestyles and things like that, there are these sort of counteracting forces for health and life expectancy that it's a little bit unclear to me, where that's going to shake out and how long it's going to take, before we really do start to see the life expect in the United States in particular, the life expectancy get to where we want it to be. And I don't know if you've seen the recent data, but in the United States, there has been a pretty dramatic flattening of the average life expectancy trajectory over time in the last 4 or 5 years. Some of that might be due to COVID, certainly, but I think a lot of it has to do with the population level lifestyle factors that are depressing health span and lifespan for many people right now.
Yeah. So when you talk about these counteracting forces, it sounds like obesity generally, with the driving factors behind that being, how much food we eat, what kinds of food we eat, how much we exercise versus how much we're sedentary. Are there other forces do you think about that are counteracting the improving technology and generally, I think, improving knowledge around sort of what we need to do to be healthy? For example, not smoking cigarettes and things like that.
Yeah. And I mean, actually, the not smoking cigarettes is a really good example of a positive change, right? Again, I remember when I was young, you saw people smoking in public all the time. And you don't see that so much, at least in the United States, or at least the parts of the United States that I live in. So that's been a very positive change. I think certainly there are a lot of factors that might contribute to depressing health span and lifespan. Again, my personal view is that the two big ones are sedentary lifestyle and being overweight and obese, combined with the types of food consumption that are driving that obesity epidemic, the very high sugar loads that a lot of people are consuming that contribute to diabetes, combined with obesity, which is a huge problem. So I think those are probably the big two. And, if I had to pick one, I would actually pick sedentary lifestyle as the single most effective thing that most people could do to increase their likelihood of living a longer and healthier life, potentially living long enough and healthy enough to benefit from the things that we're developing in the field right now, would be just be more active. Even if you're not going to change your diet, exercise regularly, and that's going to help almost everybody have a better odds of being healthier later in life. I think the other macro things that are harder to quantify right now are things like pollution, contamination, chronic stress, which I think a lot of people certainly are feeling right now. We're just hopefully coming out of a global pandemic. The pandemic itself obviously depressed average life expectancy for a couple of years. The sort of longer term effects of just going through that are a little bit harder to quantify. I think a lot of people, though, are certainly suffering from chronic stress, which affects sleep quality. We know that sleep quality is really important for health. So, I think figuring out strategies to manage those parts of your life are really important. That's a little bit outside my area of expertise, right? I focus more on the biological mechanisms, but there are definitely lots of people who are working on the relationship between chronic stress and wellness and biological outcomes that influence health. I think that's super important. Sleep quality in particular, I already mentioned, is certainly one of the pillars, along with diet and exercise, for optimizing your health going forward. But I again, my feeling is that we have a lot of control over those things. It's hard. I get it. It's really hard for a lot of people to manage the sort of pervasive, inexpensive, really good tasting food that's everywhere. But you do have control over that, and you do have control over your activity levels, and you have some control over your stress levels, and there are strategies that you can take. And so I think if people try to achieve healthier lifestyle, that will go a long ways towards maintaining health span as long as possible, and potentially benefiting then from the discoveries that are happening in the biology of aging.
Yeah, I think when you talk about these issues, I know it's like not directly in your wheelhouse. You're more focused on the biology, but I do think it's an interesting point to think of these like counter trends. And with sedentary lifestyle, at least, and obesity, I like to think about like the most common excuse for these things, because like you said, it is sort of it's in your control for the most part. But the one thing that's sort of at least reasonably sort of hard for some people to control is if they just sort of simply don't have time, or don't feel that they have time among other priorities like family and working a job or two or whatever it is. So I think about what are the things that I can do, because I'm trying to make effective use of my time just like anyone else. And I think like, what are the things I can do that actually don't take time, and so and might actually save time. So like, for example, fasting and not eating actually saves time. It doesn't take any time to not eat, obviously, and it takes time to eat. And then maybe I can allocate like those 15 minutes that I would allocate to lunch to like going for a walk, and suddenly, you're like beating down the sedentary issue in a couple of different ways. And obviously there's a lot of ways to attack it, but I think, it's a decision, and people need to like sort of feel empowered by realizing that like there are choices that they can make if they really care about living a long and healthy life.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And the one thing I would add, so a couple of things I would add. One is, I think, a really important step is what you just said, right? Recognizing that you are empowered to make some of those choices, and thinking through, just in your day-to-day life, what are some things that I can do, that will kind of move the needle in the right direction? You mentioned fasting. I think fasting can work really well for some people. The other point that I would make, though, is I think that it's important to have some self-exploration in what works for you. Fasting isn't going to work for everybody. And so I think that, we should stay away from a one size fits all approach, and people should try to be empowered to figure out for themselves and try different things and see what works. I mean, I think, again, some of this, it sounds, kind of simplistic, but I think there's a lot of value in it, right? Take the stairs instead of the elevator is a really simple one, right? That sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't do that. And so I think, those are the kinds of things that anybody almost can implement things like that into their daily life. And start small. Again, this is sort of an echo of what I said before about knowing what you're going to do when you're 20 and being on that path immediately. The same thing is true for health. I think in a lot of ways, where you don't have to be on the health and optimal fitness path from the time you're 20. Wherever you're at now, you can take steps to improve your health. And so again, I think it's really easy for people to feel beaten down because they've gotten in this mode where they're not healthy and they're not necessarily particularly happy with where they're at. And I think that can keep people from taking steps to get out of that or to make changes in their lives. And so, yeah, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I do hope that some people listening can get some value from it and maybe think about little ways that you can tweak what you're doing to again, give yourself the best chance of living a long and healthy life. And the last point I'll say is a lot of these things do intersect with the biology of aging. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't recognize. Nutrition in particular has been one of the most studied environmental factors that we know directly impacts the biology of aging. Caloric restriction, for example, is in many ways still the gold standard for slowing aging, increasing lifespan, extending health span in laboratory animals. And we've learned a lot about the biology that underlies that, the molecular mechanisms that are driving that relationship. But there's no question that our dietary choices can impact biological aging in people. And so maybe that's another way for people to think about it is, the choices you make about what you eat and how much you eat could actually be affecting the rate at which your body is aging.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because, like you said earlier, it's very personalized, it seems, at least from my sort of outside perspective. And there's sort of few general rules that seem just like automatically applicable no matter who you are.
Yeah.
And I'm excited over the next like decade or however long it is to see hopefully some more products come out that can help people, whether it's a product or, an occasional visit to see a specialist or whatever it might be, but hopefully something that's relatively accessible for people that can help them figure out, with their genetics and, with their habits and their lifestyle and various defaults that they sort of have to deal around, like what are the best, most impactful decisions that they can make, that are personal to them. And I don't know if there's anything that's amazing existing today. I know I saw you went on the podcast with Gil Blander, and I have his product Inside Tracker and had him on the podcast. I think that's a really interesting product. Still very much developing, but already probably very useful, and I've enjoyed it. There's, continuous glucose monitoring. Levels is a sponsor of the podcast, and there's not to plug all the sponsors, but Aura also, sponsors the podcast, and they do a lot around sleep and activity and things like that. And I'm hopeful that a lot of these products will just continue to get better and better as we move forward. You mentioned that this seems like we're sort of it feels like we're on the cusp of both, sort of the mainstream recognizing the work that's going on and becoming more excited and more involved about it. And then secondarily, actual, pivotal discoveries being made, maybe we can start by talking about like if any of that is going on along like the product side that's helping go mainstream, but then more generally, like zooming out, what do you think makes you feel like we're on the cusp? Because you've been in the space for or in the field for, going on 20 years, I think, or so. And I assume you haven't felt that same way for like 20 years. It's more of a recent growing
Yeah.
phenomenon. So I'd be very curious, like what's driving that feeling for you?
Sure. So let's start with the first question, which I think, if you more broadly classify the kinds of things that are available now, like you talked about glucose monitoring, Oura rings, we can sort of put those under a general heading of biomarkers, or what some people even would call biological aging clocks. And there are a variety of these clocks that look at different parameters. And I think it's still really early, but the concept is sound. The idea here is that there are a variety of different tools that we can use to sort of query your personal physiology, to get a feel for what you're doing. And it's going to be a combination of genetics and environment. So your individual genotype, combined with the environment that you are in. And I would put diet under environment. That all goes under the environment umbrella, as does activity. So when you combine that genetics by environment to get a whole picture of what's influencing your individual biology, there are a subset of markers that we can use to understand what is happening at the level of biological aging. And in principle, should be able to predict if you tweak this aspect of your environment. We're not yet to the point where we can easily tweak our genomes. So you're sort of stuck, with changing the environment, which, by the way, would also include medicines that you take. Can you tweak your environment? And when you do that, what is the impact on your biological aging rate or your biological age, right? And use that to personalize approaches that people can take. That's the goal, right? That's the holy grail to some extent. We're not there yet. You will find people selling these biological age tests, and they may or may not. They tell you something. They may or may not tell you something useful, I guess I would say. But I think we're getting there, and I think absolutely, things like continuous glucose monitoring, which to me are a little bit more direct measures of something that we're pretty sure is physiologically important. If you have bad glucose homeostasis, you want to change that. We're pretty sure that that's true. I think those kinds of things can absolutely tell you about lifestyle modifications. But, I predict over the next 5 years or so, we will see a pretty significant maturation in these biological aging tests, or I don't really like the word clocks, but that's what a lot of people call them. We'll see a pretty significant maturation there and some validation that will give us a lot more confidence that these things are really telling us, something important and actionable. I guess that's what I would say. Most of these tests that we have today aren't truly actionable, and we don't really know whether they're informing us about underlying biology of aging. And it's the biology of aging that's going to drive your future health outcomes to a large extent, ignoring stochastic things like if you get run over by a bus. So I think that's kind of where we're at. And I think we absolutely will continue to see improvements there. So then the second question, which is, why do I feel like we are sort of on the cusp of the field going mainstream? I think there are multiple things that contribute to that. Certainly, I see a lot more interest and popular interest in the field. I think, people like David Sinclair, and I don't agree with a lot of what David says, but I think he has had an impact at popularizing the field and, getting it recognized a little bit more in the public sphere. I think there has been a lot of resources coming into the field, in terms of financial resources to support research in the field. And that's been both in the public sector and the private sector, which has been really interesting. And then I also feel like, there is a start of growing recognition among physicians of the importance of actually modifying the biology of aging. Let me break that down. First thing I would say, just the fact that some physicians now recognize that biological aging is a modifiable risk factor is a big change. That has never been the case previously. I think as we educate more and more physicians that aging is actually a modifiable risk factor, that will change the way that physicians practice medicine. So I kind of call this 21st century medicine, the idea that, over the coming decades, physicians are going to stop, hopefully mostly stop being reactive. Certainly we will continue to treat disease, don't get me wrong, but the shift will go away from the first order approach being waiting until people are sick and then trying to treat their disease to keeping people healthier longer. And absolutely, the single best way to do that is to target the biology of aging, because the biology of aging is the single greatest risk factor for every major cause of death and disability in the United States and every other developed country in the world. So it just makes a lot more sense to target health that way. As physicians are starting to recognize that that's possible, that you can actually modify the biology of aging, I think we'll see this shift to 21st century medicine. And actually, I want to give a shout out to my friend Peter Attia, who is a physician and I think is really one of the great communicators in this space of that concept. So Peter calls it medicine 3.0, but it's the same idea, right? That there are strategies that we can take now to actually have an impact on the biology of aging to maximize health span and longevity. And we're starting to see more and more of that kind of communication. So I think it's all of those things. The last thing I would say is also there in the last maybe 3 years has been a proliferation of biotechnology companies in this space. And, it's been pretty dramatic and pretty rapid growth. And I think that's an indication that, we're kind of making this transition from purely laboratory-based basic research, so preclinical research, to actual clinical approaches now that companies can take where they can start to develop things like these clocks that they can market, these assays that they can market, but also therapeutics that can go through the regular FDA clinical trial process. I think that's something that's pretty new that we're seeing dozens maybe of companies trying to develop therapeutics that they can move into the clinic and get approval for from FDA. So that is really, I think, an indicator also that the field is on the cusp of really going mainstream and really having an impact.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, obviously attention and money should help, all things equal, and talent as well. Should all sort of everything else equal help to accelerate progress in the space. So I think the more it becomes sort of mainstream, the better. And to your point also, getting physicians on board and treating, the status quo case of healthy person growing less healthy and aging over time a little bit differently than we have in the past. I think it's all really good stuff. And I mean, from my perspective, which is much less, inside and much less lengthy than yours, but I sort of first became interested in this space generally, I think in like 2017 or so, stumbled upon like some of Laura Deming's work and was able to go to a couple of meetings she was having in San Francisco at the time. And I didn't really know or hear anything about it from anywhere at that time. And just over the last couple of years, I feel like, like you said, David Sinclair, I think has been a big part of it maybe, and some other influential figures, but it just seems that it feels to me as well like it's gaining momentum. But for you to say that it sort of feels like it's on the cusp obviously carries a lot more weight in my mind, that that's sort of an accurate feeling of the momentum that it's increasing. I want to raise a tweet that I saw of yours that I think is sort of relevant to the point you were making about, if you want to have the largest impact, you target aging directly. So I'm just going to read the tweet, and then I would appreciate if you like sort of just elaborated on what you meant by this and just sort of expand on it a little bit. So the tweet was a prediction: the first centimorphic senolytic to be widely used for that purpose (parentheses rapamycin ? Will be greater than tenfold more effective for healthy lifespan than the top 5 cancer therapies combined, achieved with geroscience research receiving less than 1% the funding of cancer research.
All right, lots to unpack there. So I'll start with the very end of that, which is, obviously expressing a little bit of my frustration with how underfunded the field has been. And these are just simple numbers, and then I'll give you the rationale for why I said what I said. But prior to the last year or so, because I don't know exactly what the budget is now, the budget for NIH, so NIH, National Institutes of Health, is the primary federal government funder of biomedical research. DoD funds some as well. I don't have the statistics on DoD, so we'll just look at NIH. NIH funding for cancer, just at the National Cancer Institute. There's research on cancer outside of that, so the real number is probably bigger, but just at NCI is about $6 billion with a B dollars a year. Research for the biology of aging, which is what I study. Again, it's a little bit hard to get the exact numbers, but it's probably around 300 to 350 million with an M dollars a year. So about 15-fold or so, a little bit more than that, less for biology of aging than specifically for cancer. Okay, so those are just the numbers, and that's been true. That's been skewed even more towards cancer and other specific diseases in the past. And again, we've had a war on cancer for more than 50 years now. And when it started, cancer was the second leading cause of death behind heart disease. Today, maybe with the exception of COVID, cancer is the second leading cause of death behind heart disease. Now, I don't say that to minimize all the people who've been cured of cancer. Obviously, at an individual level, curing cancer is immensely important, as is curing individuals' heart disease or kidney disease or whatever. But at the population level, I think it's useful to ask, have those resources really been put towards the most effective strategy for keeping the most people alive and healthy as long as possible? And I think if you really look at the data, it's immensely difficult to conclude that targeting individual diseases with our resources is the most efficient or effective strategy. So there are a lot of ways you can look at that, but I think, again, just to look at the statistics is helpful. If you just look at deaths due to X, right, different diseases. So the CDC is really good at keeping track of what people die from. So if you just look at deaths due to cancer, for example, you can pretty easily mathematically calculate what is the effect on life expectancy if we got rid of those. So if we had a pill that cured every single cause of cancer in every single person that ever developed cancer, what would the impact be on life expectancy? And it turns out for a typical 50-year-old woman, it's about 3 years. So when I first saw that, I was surprised because I kind of thought it would be bigger than that. It's also about the same, by the way, if we cured all forms of heart disease, about 3 years. If you cure both cancer and heart disease, you get about 6 or 7 years of added life expectancy. So, and that's, when you step back and think about it, the reason for that is pretty obvious, because if you're only fixing cancer, you're not fixing dementia or kidney disease or liver disease or diabetes, right? All the other age-related diseases are still there. And so one of those is going to get you not too long after when you normally, would have died if you got cancer. So that's why the numbers are pretty small. So then you can ask the question, well, what would the impact be if we had an intervention that successfully targeted the biology of aging? And again, I think we have to be honest, we don't have that, at least that has been proven in people yet. So we don't know the actual numbers, right? We can't say with certainty what the impact of an intervention that significantly positively impacted aging biology in people. But we can look at the effects in laboratory animals and at least be guided by that to kind of put, bounds on the potential effects in people. And we know of several different interventions that can increase lifespan in mice by, between 15 on the low, 10 on the lower end, and all the way up to like 50% for something like caloric restriction. So I would put rapamycin, which is the best drug that we've got for slowing aging, in there at about 25%, maybe as high as 30% increase in lifespan. So senolytics are a specific class of molecules that also impact the biology of aging. And we can talk a little bit about that if you want to. I can get a little bit more into the weeds, but for now, they're just one class of drugs that we have that target part of the biology of aging. They seem to increase lifespan in mice by, maybe not a huge amount, but 10, 15%. and maybe more significantly improve health span. And so if we had an effective senolytic that worked in people, you could estimate what would the impact be on lifespan and health span for that same typical 50-year-old woman. And it's much, much bigger than it is for curing cancer. So if we look at the imbalance between the resources that have gone towards curing cancer versus targeting the biology of aging, and we compare that to the potential impact on life expectancy and health span, it seems out of balance. And that really was the point that I was trying to make in that tweet. And it's still way out of balance, and that's historical, cultural, and also I think because, you could have made a reasonable argument 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that we didn't know enough about the biology of aging to throw a lot more money at it. You could have made that argument. I would have disagreed with you, but you could have reasonably made that argument. I don't think you can make that argument anymore today. And so I do think that there needs to be a shift in prioritization to keeping people healthy longer rather than waiting until people are sick and trying to cure their disease.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. And you also could have made the argument back then that, like you can now with, with billions of dollars put towards biology of aging, it's sort of unknown what the progress could or would be. And at that time, it was sort of unknown what putting X number of dollars into curing cancer could yield in 20 or 30 years or whatever it's been. And so now we sort of see, and so you can sort of like change your probabilities a little bit and be like, okay, what we can do in the field of aging with billions of dollars is much more of an unknown at this point, it would seem, than what we can do with that amount of money in cancers. Sort of the progress is more measured at this point, and we can sort of, I feel like you sort of know what you're getting for the incremental dollar. And the unknown is very exciting because rather than, like you said, you eliminate cancer and someone lives 2 or 3 years longer and then gets got by, whatever the next thing is, heart disease or whatever it might be. You're extending the full runway because all these things have one thing in common. They're coming. I mean, there's forms of cancer, of course, that come early in life and various other things, but generally aging is the common thread that makes you, vulnerable to all of these things. So if you extend the runway, slow aging by 20%, 30%, whatever it might be, it's just a huge impact. And so the possibility that the dollar, may heed value, I think is just huge. And I thought that was a great tweet. And the elaboration, I didn't know exactly what you were going to bring with the elaboration, but the elaboration is better than I could have expected. So
I'm glad to hear it. That. I think, and one other thing I would just tag on to the end of that is, I think we don't know, again, how hard it's going to be to significantly modify the biology of aging in humans. I will say everything I've seen from studies in other animals suggests that it's probably easier to successfully do that than it is to cure cancer because cancer is, such a wide spectrum of actually different mechanisms that drive different types of cancers. The ability to cure cancer after somebody has got it, and particularly after it's metastasized across the board, is, I think, immensely more challenging than having an impact on the biology of aging before the system has, become so perturbed that is pathological. I could be wrong about that, but that's my intuition. And I think certainly that seems to be the case in the preclinical studies in laboratory animals.
Right. So I want to move and talk a little bit about the dog aging project, which is a really interesting project I mentioned at the top of the episode that you've been co-directing for several years now. Can you introduce that project and sort of provide an update of sort of the history and where things are today?
Sure. So the dog aging project is kind of what the name says. It's a study of aging in dogs, not just old dogs. We're broadly trying to understand what are the most important genetic and environmental factors that influence healthy aging in companion dogs. So this is all in pet dogs. We're not doing any studies in dogs maintained in the laboratory. These are all dogs living with their owners. So there's two parts, I guess, to the dog aging project. One is what we call a longitudinal study of aging. And what that means is we're just following dogs over time in their natural environment, which it turns out is very similar to the natural environment of humans. And again, trying to understand what are the factors that cause some dogs to have shorter lifespans, to develop diseases of aging, where other dogs, live longer and live healthier. And it's purely observational. So we're not asking owners to do anything different than they normally would. And there are right now, I think, about 40,000 dogs in the longitudinal study of aging. And I'll come back to how people can get involved. We're still recruiting dogs. And so I absolutely would encourage anybody who's listening, if you have a dog and you want to contribute to this science, go to the website, dogagingproject.org, and click the nominate your dog button. It's really easy. And again, we're not asking you to change anything about what you do with your dogs. So that's the biggest part of the Dog Aging Project, is that longitudinal study of aging. There are some what we call sampled cohorts within the longitudinal study of aging. So right now, 10,000 dogs get their genome sequenced. The owners get a report back on what information comes from that. 1,000 dogs are selected for what we call the precision group. Those dogs annually, in addition to getting their genome sequenced annually, the owners will take a kit to the veterinarian when they go in for their annual exam. And we will get blood chemistry, blood plasma, actually metabolome, blood epigenome. And so we haven't gotten into the epigenetics and the epigenetic clocks, but one of the very popular aging clocks right now is what's called an epigenetic clock. And so we will be getting that annually on the dogs. And then we'll get fecal microbiome to understand how the dog's microbiome is associated with its health. So that'll happen every year. Related to the precision group, we have a healthy brain aging study where we're specifically looking at brain aging and cognitive decline and dementia in dogs. So there are about 200 dogs that will be enrolled in that study. And then the other part of the Dog Aging Project is an actual clinical trial. So you can think of the longitudinal study as trying to understand aging in dogs. The clinical trial is trying to do something about it. And that's really, where my passion lies. I'm a dog person. I've always had dogs. I have a German Shepherd now who's getting older, who I love very much. And so I certainly recognize why it's important if we're able to increase the healthy longevity of our companion animals. And so for the clinical trial, we're testing a drug called rapamycin, which I mentioned briefly previously, and it was in that tweet that you alluded to. So rapamycin right now is currently the best small molecule intervention we have for targeting the biology of aging, increasing multiple parameters of health span in laboratory mice, and extending lifespan, as I mentioned, by about 25%. So the goal of the clinical trial is really to test, does rapamycin have similar impacts on lifespan or other health span parameters in middle-aged companion dogs? So we are enrolling 580 dogs into this clinical trial. Right now, we have 9 clinical sites. It'll probably be up closer to 15 or 20 in the next 6 months. Where it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. Half the dogs get placebo, half the dogs get rapamycin. And like I said, the goal is to test whether rapamycin can increase lifespan and improve health span in companion dogs. So those are really the 2 big parts of the Dog Aging Project at the moment. We are, as I mentioned, continuing to enroll dogs in the longitudinal study. We are also continuing to enroll dogs into the rapamycin trial. It's called Triad, Test of Rapamycin in Aging Dogs. In order for dogs to be eligible for the rapamycin trial, they have to be at least 7 years old and between 40 and 110 pounds. And they can't have any significant pre-existing health conditions, because it's a study of normal aging. We can only enroll dogs that don't already have, cancer or significant heart disease or kidney disease or something like that.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a super interesting project. Rapamycin, I know you're very excited about it and testing it with the dogs. What's your perspective on, when this might be, a thing that's recommended for humans, and in what doses, and what's the path from where we are now to like getting to that point?
Yeah, so that's a really hard question to answer with any certainty, in part because, right now, I would say rapamycin, which most physicians who are familiar with rapamycin will know it under the name sirolimus. because that's just what it's called in the clinical world. It's the same molecule, same drug, or rapamycin, which is the Pfizer branded version of rapamycin. So they'll know it in that context, and they'll know it because it's mostly been used in people to prevent organ transplant rejection. And so in that context, the doses that are used are pretty high. It's given in a daily dosing regimen, and it's given with strong immunosuppressants. And so in that context, in that patient population, rapamycin has some side effects. They're not terrible, but I think that, it's got sort of a bad reputation in the clinical community because of the way it's been used. So in order for rapamycin to ever become widely prescribed, so it is a prescription drug, you need a prescription to get it legally in the United States. In order for it to ever become widely prescribed, a couple of things have to happen. One is we have to have, rock solid data from clinical trials suggesting that it's actually beneficial for the biology of aging in people. We have some hints, but I would say we're not to the point where there's a lot of certainty around that yet. And we have to get enough data on side effects and safety in healthier people who are not organ transplant patients to convince the clinical community to overcome that stigma that the drug has because of the way it's been used. My personal intuition is that the first of those is going to be easier than the second, but I don't know how long it'll take to get there. There are some clinical trials happening right now and in the following months that I think will get us closer to understanding, how effective is rapamycin at targeting specific age-related endpoints. And they're really interesting because in mice, rapamycin seems to affect the aging process in pretty much every tissue and organ where we look. It's really remarkable. In some cases, actually restoring function that has been lost. So in mice, in the heart, in the oral cavity, in the reproductive tissues, ovarian aging in particular, and in the immune system, you can actually see an aged organ that is at lower function better after the old mice of getting rapamycin for between 6 and 10 weeks. So we can start to look in people at multiple of these age-related indications and ask, do we see similar slowing of the aging process, or maybe more excitingly, improvements in function that has already been lost? And so some of the clinical trials that are starting up right now are for mild cognitive impairment, periodontal disease. So a colleague of mine, Jonathan Ahn at the University of Washington, is running a clinical trial looking at whether rapamycin can reverse periodontal disease in people. We published that it could in mice. And premature ovarian failure. So Zev Williams and Yushin Su at Columbia are running a clinical trial in women to see whether rapamycin can have an impact on ovarian failure. So we're starting to get these clinical trials up and going. And I think in the next couple of years, we'll get more and more data to give an indication, where does rapamycin seem to be working? Maybe where is it not working? Hopefully from our dog studies, we'll in parallel be getting data there on whether rapamycin is having an impact on aging in dogs. And I think as all that stuff starts to coalesce and come together, then maybe we'll reach consensus. How effective is rapamycin? But importantly, from these clinical trials, we'll get, I think, really good quality data on whether or not we see any evidence for side effects at the kind of dosing that people are thinking about with rapamycin for age-related indications. And I will say, from everything I've seen, and I've seen more than almost anybody else out there, I don't see much evidence for significant side effects at the doses that most people are using for putative health span and lifespan promoting effects. So I think we'll find that it's quite safe in that context. The question is in my mind, the question is how much efficacy will we see? And you just got to do the trials. That's why we do clinical trials.
Yep, makes sense. So I know we're already over on time, and I want to wrap things up, be respectful of your time, but closing out on the dog aging project, you sort of introduced it and talked about some of the history, but where are you hopeful that things go from here? Several years in, I think you said 40,000 dogs or so.
Yeah.
Seems to have sort of exceeded expectations. I think you set out to get like 10,000 or so.
Yeah.
And it's just really popular. And it's interesting because it sort of weaves together these dynamics of, I think it's called citizen science, basically just average people contributing to, getting involved and, volunteering their dogs and things like this. And then there's also like a crowdfunding element to it. So it's like, it feels like a very sort of new breed of science to me, at least, being
Yeah.
not as, familiar with the space. So I'm just curious sort of what your hopes are for the future and, where things might go from here.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the term that we have sort of gravitated towards is community science, but community science, citizen science, I think absolutely the participatory aspect of this project is really unique and fun. And I absolutely believe that, this is a good thing for science communication in general because it engages people who wouldn't otherwise probably participate in science in the scientific process. And because people love their dogs, I think we're able to engage a much broader community than a lot of other community science projects. And I think it's also been good for the geroscience field or the aging field, because I think the Dog Aging Project has played an important role in the concept of biological aging reaching a broader community. This is actually something that I think it's a really dogs are a really, really useful example for what I mean by the biology of aging, right? We all sort of accept by the time we're, kids, that one human year is about 7 dog years. That's not perfect, right? That's not exact, but it's pretty close. And if you really think about what that means, all that means is that dogs age about 7 times faster than people do. And so people understand in that context that there is a biology of aging, right? That genes and environment influence why some animals age faster than other animals do. And dogs, I think, are a really perfect example. That's a little bit of a tangent, but I really like to emphasize that, because I think once you can get people to recognize that there is a biology of aging, then it's not so far-fetched to think that we can actually understand that biology. And when we understand it, at least partially, we can actually do something about it. And that's really what we're trying to do in this field. So, okay, so where do I hope the Dog Aging Project goes? Again, I mentioned that we are still actively recruiting dogs, even though we have more dogs than we initially, conservatively set out to enroll in the longitudinal study. We are definitely underrepresented for some, demographics among the canine population. So particularly puppies. I think part of that is the name. People see the name Dog Aging Project and they think we only want you to sign up if you have an old dog. That's not true. If you have a puppy, please sign your puppy up. And also, people from diverse backgrounds, I think, because one of the goals is really to understand the effect of a very broad environmental diversity on aging in companion animals. And so we definitely want more people to sign up for both the longitudinal study and the clinical trial. Where there's a lot of things I hope to see. Again, for me, my real passion here is to actually have an impact on lifespan and health span in companion dogs. So I hope that, and I don't know whether this will happen in the Dog Aging Project, or I think it'll probably happen more broadly in the field in general, but I hope over the next, 3-4 years, now that we've created the template for how you would do this kind of a clinical trial, that we will see more people approaching therapeutics to have an impact on health span and lifespan in companion animals. And really, aside from the fact that it would be amazing if we could, slow aging in our dogs by 20%. From the perspective of just a pragmatic perspective, you can actually get the answer much, much faster in dogs than you can in people. So I think we're just starting to see companies think about, okay, we could go down the path of a clinical trial for, an age-related indication in people, but in parallel, maybe we can go down the path of a clinical trial for having an impact on aging in companion animals. And so the first company, I think, to really, be public about this sort of an approach, which I love, I'm a big fan, is a company called Loyal, where they are actually on the for-profit side, developing therapeutics and in a very strategic way, testing those for effects on the aging process in dogs. So I would really like to see multiple clinical trials, multiple interventions being taken forward in the veterinary world at the same time that we're seeing this proliferation of clinical trials, for age-related indications in humans. And so I think that'll happen. And I hope that, I can't see any reason why 5 years from now, we can't have clinically proven therapeutics to slow aging in dogs. Like, this biology will work. We just need to have enough shots on goal to figure out which interventions work and how effective they are. So that's really where I hope we are five years or so from now.
Awesome. Well, I know we're over on time, like I said, but very exciting future, I think, ahead for the dog aging project and for the field at large. It does feel, just talking to you, it feels like we're on the cusp of something. And I certainly hope that's the case and that there's a lot of great breakthroughs and increased attention and funding and talent and everything like that in the years to come. So appreciate you again for taking the time, Matt. And just wrapping things up, where can people go to follow along, you and the various things you're working on, moving into the future?
Yeah. So I mentioned the Dog Aging Project website, dogagingproject.org. My laboratory website is Kaeberlein.org. So just my last name. And then I'm not great on social media, but I'm, somewhat active on Twitter. So if you're interested in following me on Twitter, it's @mkaeberlein, my first initial and my last name.